How and where the top Wild West legends died. Did you know that one of the legends of the Wild West was responsible for one of the bloodiest massacres of the Civil War? We'll uncover that grim chapter soon enough. But before we get there, we got a whole trail of history to ride. From dusty battlefields to outlaw raids, this story cuts deep into the heart of frontier America. And hey, while you're here, we'd love to know where and when you're tuning in. Are you listening on a quiet evening ride, or catching this tale during your morning coffee? Drop a comment below and let us know. Now, let's get started. John Simpson Chisum was one of the most influential cattle barons of the American West, known not only for his vast herds and open-range empire, but also for his role in shaping the cattle industry in New Mexico and influencing the violent Lincoln County War. He was a key figure in the transformation of the Southwest from wild frontier to settled ranch land, leaving behind a legacy marked by ambition, conflict, and frontier enterprise. Born on August 15, 1824 in Hardeman County, Tennessee, Chisum moved with his family to Texas in the 1830s. Settling near Paris, Texas, he began working as a store clerk before entering the cattle business. By the 1850s, he was supplying beef to the Confederate Army during the Civil War, having built a respectable herd grazing along the Quantrill River. His rail ascent began after the war. In the late 1860s, Chisum moved his operations westward into the open ranges along the Pecos River in southeastern New Mexico territory. There, he established one of the first and largest cattle ranches in the region, spanning hundreds of miles. His cattle bore the famous Jingle Bob earmark, and he employed hundreds of cowboys, including a young Billy the Kid for a time. Chisum's ranch supplied beef to U.S. Army forts, Native American reservations, and mining camps throughout the Southwest. His trail, often called the Chisum Trail, was one of the major conduits for cattle heading north to railheads in Kansas. At his peak, Chisum reportedly owned over 100,000 head of cattle and controlled enough land to make him one of the largest landholders in the American West. But such power inevitably drew conflict. In the 1870s, Chisum became embroiled in the Lincoln County War, a deadly power struggle between rival economic factions in New Mexico. The war pitted Chisum and his allies, including Alexander McSween and the Lincoln-based Tunstall faction, against a corrupt monopoly run by Lawrence Murphy and James Dolan, who dominated the region's mercantile trade and controlled the local law enforcement. Although Chisum did not participate directly in the violence, he played a critical role by financing the anti-Murphy faction and supporting their efforts to break the monopoly. He backed John Tunstall and later supported the Regulators, the group that included Billy the Kid and fought on behalf of McSween after Tunstall was murdered. Chisum's involvement helped tip the scales in a conflict that left dozens dead and destabilized the region for years. Following the war, Chisum tried to distance himself from the escalating violence. He refused to continue paying Billy the Kid for his services, which led to a personal rift. Billy the Kid later accused Chisum of owing him $500, and when Chisum refused to pay, the Kid resorted to rustling Chisum's cattle. Their feud became part of the Outlaws legend. Despite these troubles, Chisum remained a towering figure in New Mexico's ranching world. He worked closely with other prominent cattlemen, including Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving, contributing to the development of major cattle trails and helping define ranching practices in the territory. He was known for his business acumen, his imposing presence, and his determination to control both the land and the economy around him. Chisum never married and had no legitimate heirs, though he was rumored to have fathered children with a former slave named Jency. His personal life remained largely private, and he focused intensely on his business and land. By the early 1880s, the cattle frontier was beginning to change. The open range was closing, barbed wire fences were dividing the land, and railroads were reshaping transportation. Chisum, now aging and ailing, recognized the end of an era. In 1884, seeking treatment for what was believed to be cancer or kidney disease, Chisum traveled to Eureka Springs, Arkansas, a resort town known for its healing waters. He died there on December 22, 1884, at the age of 60. His body was returned to Paris, Texas, and buried in Evergreen Cemetery. John Chisum left behind no written memoir, but his legacy lived on in the stories of those who worked for him, fought beside him, or challenged his dominance. The town of Chisum in New Mexico was named in his honor, and his story has been dramatized in Western films and novels as a symbol of frontier enterprise and the raw ambition of the cattle barons. John Chisum was not merely a rancher. He was a builder of empires, a silent general in a war for economic power, and a cornerstone of Western history. His life offers a vivid window into the ambition, expansion, and conflict that defined the American frontier in the second half of the 19th century. If you enjoyed the story from the frontier, be sure to saddle up and ride with us again. Subscribe, share, and let us know which legend you want to hear about next, partner. Charlie Siringo was a cowboy, detective, and author whose life intersected with both the myth and the reality of the American West. Born February 7, 1855, in Matagorda County, Texas, he would grow up to become one of the most versatile frontier figures of his time, bridging the era of cattle drives with the rise of modern law enforcement. Siringo wasn't just a witness to history. He helped shape it, then wrote it down for the world to read. He began his cowboy career at age 15, riding the open trails and working with outfits like the LX Ranch in the Texas Panhandle. Siringo became an expert in all things ranching, breaking horses, branding cattle, and enduring the punishing miles of the trail. He worked the goodnight-loving trail, helped drive herds through the Chisum Trail, and lived the hard life that dime novels only dreamed of. These years gave him a deep understanding of the cowboy way and a first-hand view of the lawlessness and drama that defined the frontier. In 1885, Siringo published A Texas Cowboy, one of the first memoirs written by a working cowboy. The book became wildly popular, offering readers in the East and across Europe a vivid account of cattle drives, saloons, and shootouts. It painted an authentic picture of frontier life, far different from the exaggerated fiction of the day. Siringo was no novelist. He was a man who had lived every dusty mile of what he wrote. But he didn't stop with storytelling. In 1886, Charlie Siringo joined the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, a move that transformed him from cattleman to undercover lawman. He would serve with the agency for over 2 decades, operating under assumed names and infiltrating some of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the country. His cowboy grit and plain-spoken nature made him a natural operative in the rough-and-tumble world of frontier justice. One of his earliest assignments was tracking down rustlers and robbers across the West. He posed as a laborer, a drifter, even a criminal himself. He tracked outlaws in New Mexico, Wyoming, and Montana, living undercover among them, gathering intelligence, and then striking when the time was right. His most famous case was his pursuit of the Wild Bunch Gang, led by Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Siringo spent years tracking their movements, helping lay the groundwork for the gang's eventual downfall. Unlike many of his Pinkerton colleagues, Siringo preferred working alone. He traveled thousands of miles by horse, rail, and foot to gather evidence and make arrests. His methods were unconventional, but his results were undeniable. He was known for being patient, thorough, and relentless, a lawman who blended in with the outlaws until it was time to bring them in. However, Siringo's loyalty to the Pinkertons began to fray in the early 1900s. He grew disillusioned with the agency's increasing involvement in labor disputes, where they were hired to break strikes and infiltrate unions. Siringo believed in justice, not in suppressing working men for corporate bosses. When he began writing about his Pinkerton work, the agency tried to silence him, suing him and forcing him to redact or alter entire sections of his manuscripts. Even so, he pushed forward. His books, such as Two Evil Isms, Pinkertonism and Anarchism, and later A Cowboy Detective, offered rare glimpses into the life of an undercover agent in the Old West. Though censored, they were rich with stories of manhunts, shootouts, and standoffs with some of the most wanted criminals of his era. Siringo retired from active detective work around 1907, but remained a passionate chronicler of the West until his death. He moved to California, where he continued to write and speak about the era he had helped define. He even worked briefly in Hollywood as a technical advisor on early Western films, though he quickly grew frustrated with their inaccuracies and embellishments. In his later years, Siringo became increasingly vocal about preserving the truth of the frontier. He saw how legend had eclipsed fact and how men he had known, some brave, some brutal, were being romanticized beyond recognition. He believed the West didn't need myths. It needed memory. Charlie Siringo died on October 18, 1928, in Altadena, California. He was 73 years old. Though not as instantly recognizable as some of the outlaws he chased, his legacy is just as enduring. Siringo lived the Wild West, then helped close its chapter with his pen. He was a cowboy who became a detective, a lawman who became a historian, and a man who, above all, told the truth about the frontier as he saw it. His name might not be carved into every textbook, but if you want to understand the real West, the dust, the danger, the grit, and the ghosts, then Charlie Siringo is a man worth knowing. So tip your hat to the cowboy detective who rode both sides of the frontier and left behind a trail of truth. William Clark Quantrill was one of the most feared and controversial figures of the American Civil War and the violent frontier era that followed. To some, he was a Confederate guerrilla leader and patriot. To others, a murderous outlaw whose tactics blurred the line between warfare and terrorism. His legacy is soaked in blood, legend, and bitter division, earning him a notorious place in the story of the Wild West. Quantrill was born on July 31st, 1837, in Canal Dover, Ohio. Raised in a modest family, he trained as a teacher before drifting westward. He eventually settled in Kansas in the late 1850s, a region already boiling with conflict between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions. Known as Bleeding Kansas, this territory became a flashpoint for violence, and it was here that Quantrill began his descent into guerrilla warfare. By the time the Civil War broke out in 1861, Quantrill had thrown in with the Southern cause, but unlike traditional soldiers, he did not don a uniform or follow battlefield orders. Instead, he organized a band of irregular fighters, bushwhackers, who waged a brutal campaign across the Missouri-Kansas border. His men fought not for territory, but for vengeance, plunder, and ideology. Their tactics were unconventional, their targets often civilian, and their retribution swift and merciless. Quantrill's most infamous act came on August 21st, 1863, in the quiet town of Lawrence, Kansas. Riding in at dawn with nearly 450 men, Quantrill's raiders descended upon the town in one of the bloodiest massacres of the Civil War. Over the next 4 hours, they murdered approximately 150 men and boys, most of them unarmed civilians, burned homes and businesses, and left the town in ashes. Quantrill claimed the raid was retaliation for Union raids and the deaths of Confederate women in a Kansas City jail collapse. To his enemies, it was a massacre. To his supporters, a dark act of justice. The Lawrence Massacre earned Quantrill widespread infamy. The Union Army responded with fierce reprisals, and Missouri's bushwhackers, including Quantrill, became the targets of an increasingly brutal counterinsurgency. Quantrill's forces splintered, his authority weakened, and the raiders scattered into smaller bands. Yet for a time, his name carried weight. Notably, some of his followers went on to become infamous outlaws after the war, including Jesse James and Cole Younger. These men took their wartime skills, shooting, ambush, escape, and applied them to train and bank robbery in the post-war West. In many ways, Quantrill's guerrilla band served as a training ground for the next generation of frontier criminals. Despite his growing notoriety, Quantrill's life after Lawrence spiraled into paranoia and decline. He continued raiding with reduced numbers, often falling out with former allies. His authority crumbled as new leaders like Bloody Bill Anderson emerged. Anderson was even more vicious, known for scalping enemies and riding with human trophies. The violence escalated beyond even Quantrill's control. By 1864, Quantrill's faction was scattered and demoralized. He attempted to regroup in Kentucky, far from the burned-out battlefields of Kansas and Missouri. But his time was nearly up. In May 1865, just weeks after the official end of the Civil War, Quantrill was ambushed near Taylorsville, Kentucky, by Union troops. Shot in the back while trying to flee, he was taken prisoner. Quantrill lingered for nearly a month in captivity, paralyzed from the wound. On June 6, 1865, at the age of 27, he died in a military prison hospital in Louisville, Kentucky. Though his life was short, his impact on American history, particularly in the borderlands of Kansas and Missouri, was profound. Even after death, Quantrill's legacy remained unsettled. In Missouri, Some ex-Confederates remembered him as a brave, if ruthless defender of Southern rights. In Kansas, his name became a synonym for atrocity. His remains were exhumed and reburied multiple times, becoming the center of bizarre controversies and macabre souvenirs. Parts of his body, his skull reportedly, were kept by collectors before being interred in Dover, Ohio, decades later. William Quantrill's story is not one of redemption or simple villainy. He was a product of fractured America, where war blurred into personal revenge and justice turned into blood feuds. His rise was fueled by ideology, but sustained by chaos, violence, and the vacuum of law that defined the frontier. His tactics, hit-and-run raids, disguised as psychological warfare, would influence guerrilla movements for generations. He is often cited in military histories for his pioneering role in asymmetrical warfare. Even as his actions remained morally condemned, his recruits went on to shape the myth of the American outlaw, turning real historical trauma into folklore and dime novel fame. Modern historians struggle with Quantrill's place in the past. Some view him as an insurgent who exploited chaos for personal power. Others emphasize the political roots of his rebellion, placing him within the larger context of a nation at war with itself. What is certain is that he left an indelible mark on the American psyche. There are no monuments to Quantrill in the towns he burned or the lands he raided, yet his name lingers like smoke on the prairie. Unforgotten, unwelcome, but undeniably part of the story. In life, he stalked the borderlands between hero and villain. In death, he remains a symbol of the darkest edge of the Wild West. If you ride out to the hills of Missouri or walk the rebuilt streets of Lawrence, Kansas, you'll find whispers of his legacy in old buildings, quiet cemeteries, and the wary memories of local lore. The ghosts of the Civil War still wander there, and Quantrill's shadow walks among them. So when we talk of legends from the Wild West, let's not forget the darker names. Not all who shaped the frontier wore a badge or built a ranch. Some, like William Quantrill, carved their names into the land with fire and gunpowder. Subscribe and saddle up for more stories from the edge of the American frontier. Because out here, the past isn't dead. It's just waiting to be remembered.